Hello, welcome back to part 3 of our look at the organization and structure of the heart and blood vessels. This is going to be setting up a lot of what we're going to look at next with next lecture with regards to physiology. Found within the cardiovascular system. And so this is, again, this week here, we're really focused on building the foundations of understanding. The other thing I want to make sure is clear is we have not spent a lot of time talking about the physical anatomy of the heart, bicuspid valves, tricuspid valves, trabeculae coronae, chordae tendineae. That's because we've done that within the lab. But please understand, you're responsible to know those parts as it relates to the topics that we are covering here in lecture. And so I wanted to make sure that that was clear and that that expectation was not lost upon each and every one of you, because that would be bad if it was lost. And so with that said, in today's lesson, what we're going to be looking at here is the cardiac cycle. How does blood move from atria to ventricle, to the pulmonary circuit, back to the left atria, to the left ventricle, and out to the aorta? Because this is important. There's not just electrical stimulation that is happening like what we looked at in the last class, in the last lesson. There's more to it. And so let's go ahead and let's begin our look of the cardiac cycle. And so we have to start this process someplace. There is no beginning and no end, so to speak, to this cycle. As the atria are filling, the ventricles are emptying. And as the ventricles are filling, the atria are emptying. And so there's always this reciprocal give and take. And so when we say that we start a cycle with ventricular filling, this is an arbitrary place to start. And understand that both right and left ventricles are filling simultaneously. Right? When we deal with atrial filling, right, both right and left atria are filling simultaneously. And so that is very important to keep in mind. One of the first criteria in order for a ventricle to fill is the pressure within the ventricle has to be lower than the pressure within the atria. Right, so atrial pressure is higher than ventricular pressure. Now, one of the things that you should keep in mind is this idea of blood pressure. And we know that the standard for normal blood pressure is 120 over 80. Well, what does that 120 over 80 really mean? And how does it relate to this idea of ventricular filling and or atrial filling? Well, here's what we need to keep in mind. Right? First of all, the 120 represents the systolic number. Right? Now remember, systolic is high pressure. All right. The 80 represents the diastolic value, which remember is low pressure. And collectively, this 120 over 80 is the systolic, is the high pressure number over the low pressure number within the aorta. And so this is the pressure that is being experienced within the aorta after leaving the left ventricle. And so that's important for us to keep in mind. The ventricles are never completely void of blood, right? Which means the ventricles are never completely void of pressure. They never reach zero, just like the atria never reach zero. There's always some pressure that is maintained. Think of it as like priming a pump. All right, so if you're at one of those old-time water pumps, one of those old-time wells, we have to lift the handle and go down and prime it. The heart doesn't have to do that. There's always some tension, there's always some pressure left within the ventricles and or the atria as it prepares for the next filling that leads to the next round of contraction. And so that is important to keep in mind. Right? So the ventricular pressure has to be lower than the atrial pressure in order for the ventricles to fill. Why? Because a fluid is going to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. Right? High pressure to low pressure. That is how fluid moves throughout the heart. And so in order for the ventricles to fill, right, the atrioventricular valves must open. Now, part of what allows the AV valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, to open is pressure from within the atria. So as the atria fill, it puts pressure down on the atrioventricular valves, and that begins to force them open. What finalizes this process is the SA node that is now firing off action potentials to the right and the left atria that stimulates muscular contraction. And so there's a little bit of a squeeze that happens within the atria. So between high pressure with a little bit of muscular contraction, that blood moves through the atrioventricular valves, right atria, tricuspid, right ventricle, left atria, bicuspid, left ventricle, and the ventricles begin to fill. Right? The ventricles begin to fill. As the ventricles begin to fill, there is pressure, if you would, that is put on the papillary muscle. So the papillary muscle begins to tighten up because the ventricle is expanding. And as the papillary muscle is feeling pressure, it's tugging on the chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae, we know, is attached to the atrioventricular valve. And so what ends up happening is, as that pressure is increasing within the ventricle, the papillary muscle gets constricted or contracted, which pulls on the chordae tendineae, which then ultimately pulls on the atrioventricular valve and closes it. And so that is what prevents more blood from leaving the atria, overfilling the ventricle. Right? Ventricle begins to fill, expanding the ventricle, pulling on the papillary muscle, pulling on the chordae tendineae, closing that atrioventricular valve, not allowing any more blood to go ahead and enter into the ventricles. Diastasis, right, or the diastolic pressure, we know is low pressure. Right? And so that is characterized as after the muscles have contracted, after the ventricles have contracted. And so in other words, this is an area, once again, of returning back to low pressure where the muscles are relaxed. All right? And this is going to allow the ventricles to fill once again. Again, what stimulates this whole process, besides the atria filling with blood, creating higher pressure, is the sinoatrial node firing to go ahead and allow the atria to contract. A little bit of a squeeze just to force that blood through the atrioventricular valves. So, ventricular systole is high pressure within the ventricles. This is what we achieve after ventricular filling. The ventricles have filled. Right? You now have high pressure within the ventricles. And so what is happening with our action potential series? Okay. Well, the SA node fires off, and that action potential then stimulates the AV node. And during ventricular systole, this is why you have a delay. Right, this is why you have your delay. You got to give the ventricles time to contract, and when that happens, action potentials begin to come down the right and left branches of the bundle of His, stimulating the Purkinje fibers. And when the Purkinje fibers have been stimulated, the ventricles will begin to contract. Right, the ventricles begin to contract. At the present time, your semilunar valves, your pulmonary semilunar valve and your aortic semilunar valve, are in a closed state. Right? But you've got a higher amount of pressure within the ventricles. You've got lower pressure within the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And so that blood, as the ventricle contracts because of stimulation through the Purkinje fibers, that blood then gets pushed through the semilunar valves. All right? Your atrioventricular valves are closed, and that blood is released. About 50 to 60, maybe 70% of the blood is expelled from the ventricles. Right? So there is some variability on that. Naturally, if you're running or you're working out, more blood is ejected, right, to maintain a higher pressure and consistent blood flow to deliver more oxygen. When you're at rest, you're closer to that 50% mark. Right? So once again, let's follow that logic. Right? Let's follow this through to make sure that this is making sense. SA node fires to the atria and the AV node. Right? While that is happening, ventricles begin to fill. Blood moves from atria to the ventricles. Right? Now, there's a little bit of a delay when that action potential gets to the AV node, because again, we got to give time for the ventricles to fill. So remember what we said, that the AV nodes fire slower than the SA node. All right? And so now that the AV node has the action potential, has the stimulation, it then goes ahead and stimulates the bundle of His, which is in the interventricular septum. Right? And at the same time, ventricles are still filling. Then, bundle of His passes that electrical stimulation, that action potential, to the right and left branches, down to the Purkinje fibers, and this stimulates ventricular contraction. Which then allows for ventricular, as I've already said, contraction. All right. So, again, what is happening between here and here is the AV valves close, while the AV valves, while the semilunar valves remain closed. Down here, those semilunar valves then open. And that is what as the ventricular contraction is going to eject that blood into either the pulmonary trunk if it's coming from the right ventricle, or into the aortic arch if it's coming from the left ventricle. All right. So this is what's happening during ventricular systole. We have this high pressure within the ventricle that is then expelled throughout the appropriate vessel. Pulmonary trunk is going to go to the lungs, and the aortic arch or the aorta is going to go systemically and also supply the coronary as well. Again, the key here is about half of the blood is ejected, up to about 70% of the blood is ejected out of each of the ventricles respectively. We know that the left ventricle is a little bit larger than the right ventricle. Right? And we also know that the left ventricle is surrounded by a thicker myocardium, and the right ventricle has lesser myocardium surrounding the right ventricle. By the way, that makes sense because the right ventricle is only pumping blood to the lungs, which is real close to the heart, so you don't need as much muscular contraction. Whereas the left ventricle has to have a larger area of myocardium, because that left ventricle has to have enough force behind it to eject the blood into the aorta and send that blood systemically. And so it's got to have that high pressure that is behind it. After the blood has been expelled from the right and left ventricles, then you enter into ventricular diastole. You enter into this low pressure phase. In other words, ventricular pressure drops below atrial pressure. And when that happens, semilunar valves close and the process starts over. The superior and inferior vena cava then begin to go ahead and fill the right atria, and the pulmonary veins return blood back into the left atria, returning that blood from the lungs. All right, and so the process starts over. So what does this all look like? I love this diagram. This is a great diagram. This puts everything into perspective for us. Know this diagram. If you know this diagram, you know the last 3 or 4 slides worth of information that we have gone over. And so this is a great summary table. And look, everything is color-coded, and it tells you what is opened and what is closed. And so you see here in the first picture, all right, here is your right atria. Your left atria is over here. All right, and so your atria are contracting. All right, and as the atria contract, your atrioventricular valves are open. But look at this. Your ventricles here are relaxed, and your pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves are closed. That's what the yellow means. All right. We enter into ventricular systole, which are both of these here. This is early, this is late, so this is as it's filling, and this is after it's filling. All right. But what do we see? We see that the atria go into low pressure. We see that the as the ventricles are filling, this is what the blue is. This is where contraction is going to be happen. All right. So we're in ventricular systole, high pressure. All right. So think about what's happening. We're going from the AV node to the bundle of His down to the Purkinje fibers. That's leading to this contraction. All right, but look, remember what I said, all the valves here are closed. And so your AV valves are closed and your semilunar valves are closed. All right. In late ventricular systole, your semilunar valves are now open because contraction has occurred and that blood is now moving out of the ventricles, right? But yet your AV valves are both closed. And then you enter into this period where really it's an isovolumetric system. So blood is, for a brief second, blood is not entering into the atria. Right? Your ventricles are experiencing diastole, low pressure, and everything is closed. Right? And then your atria will begin to fill again. Right? Tension is now off of the AV valves, right? And that tension is off, meaning the ventricles are relaxed, the papillary muscles are relaxed, the chordae tendineae are relaxed, and so the AV valves have no tension to keep them closed, and so they can go ahead and they're considered open at that point in time. Again, great summary table of what we see happening here. Right. This is just another view of that. This is a little bit of a simplistic view, just in case you like simple over more complex. And so now what I want to kind of consider here is the third aspect of this, and this is what is happening electrically. I mean, yeah, we know you have the SA node and the AV node. You know that you have the bundle of His and the right and left branches and the Purkinje fibers. And we know that each stage of that movement of the action potential is coordinated and correlated with atrial systole, ventricular diastole, ventricular systole, and atrial diastole. We understand that, but what we need to look at now is how does this look graphically? And to do that, we need to look at electrocardiograms, or what we refer to as an ECG, or if you are in Europe, it's what we call an EKG, and it's more commonly what we refer to as an EKG here in the States. And so let's go ahead and take a look at parts of an EKG. Right. We have a P wave. And this is the first part of the EKG. Right. And this represents atrial depolarization. In other words, this represents the SA node stimulating contraction within the atria. From there, we have the QRS complex, and the QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization. In other words, the QRS complex is when you are experiencing ventricular systole, and the action potentials have moved from the bundle of His to the right and left branches of the bundle of His to the Purkinje fibers, and the cells have depolarized, which is going to lead to contraction. Now, what's important here to keep in mind is that when the ventricle is depolarizing, the atria then begin to repolarize. Go back to A&P1 with this. All right. So the atria, the muscle within the atria, have to go through and repolarize. That is happening during the QRS complex, but it's hidden. It's masked. You don't actually see that represented on the EKG because ventricular depolarization is a much more powerful response. And so that is what actually gets recorded. We don't really see atrial repolarization within the EKG. And then we have T wave, and the T wave is ventricular repolarization. And so the muscle within the ventricles, the muscles within the myocardium and the interventricular septum have to then go ahead and repolarize itself. And that is recorded on the EKG. And so that's what you're seeing right here. All right, and so here is your P wave. Here's your QRS, which again is ventricular depolarization. All right, atrial repolarization is happening here as well, but it's masked. And then here's your T wave, which is again signaling ventricular repolarization. You're going to find out in lab as we learn how to read an EKG a little bit more and actually look at an EKG and kind of experience what that looks like, what that process looks like of recording it. What will end up happening is you'll actually be able to use that EKG to go ahead and determine heart rate, beats per minute. And I'll show you how to do that within the lab. And so that's kind of where we're heading with the lab. All right. Now, what do we use the EKG for in terms of clinical application? Well, we use it to determine when a heart rate is accelerated, all right, And does anybody know what that is referred to when an EKG has a normal rhythm? All right, but that rhythm is accelerated or happens at an increased rate. Anybody know what that is referred to as? I can hear you guys thinking it. I can hear some of you saying it. That is what we define as being tachycardic, right, or tachycardia. Right? So when a patient is tachycardic, that is a fast heart rate, but that EKG is saying, yep, nope, this is happening at a regular interval, but it's accelerated. Right? When we have a slow heart rate, right, but yet the interval is maintained, that is what we define as being bradycardic, right, or bradycardia. And then in order to have an arrhythmia, right, right, what an arrhythmia is, that is a completely irregular heartbeat. It's fast, it's slow, the intervals are not consistent, and so the EKG is all over the place. Right? And that is what we would define as an arrhythmia. I will also mention that for a normal heart rate, we're looking at usually generally between 60 and 100 beats per minute. All right? About 60 to 100 beats per minute. Sometimes it's a little bit lower, but it really should not be above that 100. And again, I'll show you how to calculate beats per minute within the lab. And so anything that is significantly lower than 60 beats per minute would be bradycardic. Anything that is above 100 beats per minute would be defined as being tachycardic. This again is just a really nice summary image of everything that we have looked at with EKGs. Right. Hopefully you're starting to get this bigger picture of being able to relate this. And again, this is why I like this diagram, because it's not only showing you what's happening within the EKG, it's again color coding that and relating that to what is happening here in the heart during each phase. So what I want you to get this mental image of, and what I want you to be able to describe, stand in front of a mirror and go through this process. Listen to yourself saying the process. That is a phenomenal way of reviewing material. Right? Hands down, that is the best way. If you can say it out loud, and if it's wrong, you're going to catch yourself. If you're just staring at pages and words on a page, you're going to miss something, because your brain's not actively engaged. But if you're talking, your brain is actively engaged, and now you're hearing those words. I do it all the time. I catch myself making blunders. It's like, oh, yep, nope, that didn't sound right. What did I just say? You catch yourself. Do the same thing with this process, because what I want you to be able to do is describe not only the anatomy, but fluid mechanics. How does the pressure change within each chamber that drives the blood through the heart? And what are the structures that the blood's passing through? What's working together to coordinate this? Right? And on top of that, what is happening electrically? What is happening with the SA node and the AV node and the bundle of His? And how does the fluid mechanics, systole, diastolic, or diastole, right? High pressure, low pressure, how does that relate to the anatomy, relate to the electrical process of the SA and the AV and the bundle of His and the Purkinje's? And how does all of that tie together in this visual representation of what we see here as an EKG? Because all of this, again, ties together. This is what we call a Wiggers diagram. All right, and I want to make sure that you guys heard me correctly on that. Sometimes my Jersey accent masks what I am saying. All right. This is what we call a Wiggers diagram. Right. Wiggers diagram is a diagram that looks at pressure and sounds and volume, systolic versus diastolic, and relates it to the phases of the cardiac cycle. And by the way, it also looks at the EKG. And so Wigger's diagram, Carl Wigger, was the researcher that kind of compiled this view, this menage a trois view of the cardiac cycle. What's happening anatomically, what's happening electrically, and what's happening pressure-wise, fluid mechanics, and married all three of those together into this diagram right here. So this is a great way of, again, summarizing all of that material. Real quick, I want to touch on cardiac output versus stroke volume. All right. Because all of this is your systolic and diastolic values within the ventricles directly relate to how much blood per minute is the heart pumping out. Right? And the volume of blood being pumped from the ventricles every minute is what we define as cardiac output. And so this is the combined blood flow into the pulmonary trunk as well as the aorta. Right? At rest, we would expect cardiac volume to be a little bit lower. During exercise, that cardiac volume is, of course, or cardiac output is going to go up. Cardiac output is directly related to stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped from the ventricles each cycle. Right? So you go through one complete cardiac cycle, how much blood was ejected from the right and left ventricles. Right? And that is what stroke volume is. So stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the ventricle in one beat or one cardiac cycle. Right? How many times does stroke volume collectively pump out blood per minute? Right? And how much blood is that is what we define as being cardiac output. Right? That's what we define as being cardiac output. So cardiac output is milliliters of blood per minute equals stroke volume times heart rate. Right? Stroke volume times heart rate is cardiac output. And this here is a nice little video for you that kind of reviews the importance of cardiac output and how it relates to everything. So you will have that slide. I will gladly go ahead and share that with you so that way you can kind of engage with it a little bit more and get a better understanding of it. Right. The other thing that I will say here is that what regulates stroke volume, what regulates how much blood the ventricles are allowed to go ahead and release per cycle, depends on three things. Right? Preload, in other words, how much blood was in the ventricle prior to contraction. That's your preload. All right? Contractility. Think back to muscle physiology in A&P1. Right? You should have talked about the fact that factors that are affecting the efficiency of muscle contraction depends on, to some extent, how stretched the sarcomeres are. So if the muscle is really tight and you have a lot of overlap in the sarcomere, there's not a whole lot of room for contraction. You're going to get a weaker contraction. Well, in cardiac muscle, if contractility is not there, if you have a lot of overlap within the sarcomeres of the cardiac muscle, you're going to eject less blood. Ejection of less blood is lower stroke volume, which means ultimately you have lower cardiac output. Right? But if and likewise, if the sarcomeres are overstretched, you're going to have reduced contractility as well. You're going to be able to, your preload is going to be high because the muscles are contracted, the ventricles are expanded. So you're going to have a huge preload. Right? But your ability to create a forceful contraction is going to be decreased. Just like when the sarcomeres are excessively overlapping. Right? The ventricles are going to be smaller because the muscle tissue is tighter. Your preload is going to be less. And so that you have to find that just right. It's kind of like Goldilocks and the three contractile fibers. All right. Goldilocks goes to the first muscle fiber and it's too overstretched. Can't do anything with it. It goes to the next one and the muscle fibers are overlapping way too much and she gets a cramp. That's not good. But she goes to the third muscle fiber and the muscle fibers, the sarcomeres, are just perfectly overlapped. And when the big bad wolf comes, she's able to get away because the muscle fibers were just right. You're probably thinking, oh my God, what is wrong with him at this point in time? He has completely lost his ever-loving mind. The first lab practical broke me. Look what you all have done to me. Afterload is how much blood is left over after the muscle contracts. And so all three of these go into determining stroke volume. Why does afterload matter? Because afterload is going to determine how much more blood can be moved into the ventricles on the next cardiac cycle. So the lower the afterload is, the more blood can be moved from the atria to the ventricles. All right. And again, this here is a nice little diagram here that explains these three factors and how they can go ahead and alter stroke volume. So increased preload, increased contractility, and decreased afterload. So you can kind of work through that. And again, it gives you a visual representation of what in the world is going on. Okay. Last little thing that I would like to touch on, and that is just a real quick overview of the anatomy of the blood vessels. Whether you're dealing with an artery or a vein, capillaries are different. We'll talk about capillaries in the next video series. But arteries and veins have the same anatomy. They just look slightly different. If they didn't, they would all be arteries or they would all be veins. But they have the same three layers, structural layers, but they are arranged a little differently. And so from deep to superficial, you have the tunica intima, which directly is lining the lumen of your vessel. You have the tunica media, which is typically made up of smooth muscle and or elastic not connective tissue, but elastic fibers within the muscle. And then you have the tunica externa, which is really a loose connective tissue, almost like an areolar connective tissue that is surrounding the overall vessel. So arteries and veins have these same three layers. Tunica intima is the deepest layer. It's what directly comes in contact with the lumen of the vessel. Tunica media is where your smooth muscle is located for contraction, and then your tunica externa is your connective tissue. So epithelial, smooth muscle, and loose connective tissue, areolar connective tissue. All right. Capillaries, again, are a little bit different, and so we'll consider them separately. Capillaries, by the time the blood reaches capillary beds, it's very low pressure. All right. It's about 25 millimeters, 25 over 8 millimeters of mercury usually is what we see within the capillaries. And we'll talk more about that later. But the reason why the capillaries cannot handle high amounts of pressure is because they are one cell thick. It's basically, capillaries are really just endothelial cells with a little bit of a layer of connective tissue over them. They don't really have musculature or anything like that. The smooth muscle layer is just not there. All right. And within veins, what you need to consider is that the tunica media is greatly reduced as well. They have less smooth muscle within the vessels, and so they actually have to rely on, to get the blood back up to the heart from the abdominal cavity and the lower extremities. We actually rely on skeletal muscle to contract, which squeezes on the veins, which pushes the blood up. And again, we'll talk more about that in the next series of lectures. But you can see here, you can see those layers. All right, again, here's that endothelial layer right here. Right, that makes up the tunica intima, right, or the tunica interna. Sometimes textbooks are a little bit different with their terminology. It's the same thing. Right. Tunica media, again, here is the smooth muscle layer here in an artery, but look at it in the vein. Again, it's greatly reduced. And then the tunica externa, or what you will sometimes hear it referred to as the tunica adventitia. Right? This is connective tissue. Right? Fairly similar between the two. Right? And again, this is what it looks like histologically, right? Which is part of the lab. So you need to be able to identify these layers within the lab. And that is where we will end. I know this video was a little bit longer, but I wanted to kind of get this all in. And this is really the summary of everything that we looked at in the first two videos. This hopefully tied everything in nice and neat for you, put it in a little bow, and that you are understanding this relationship, again, between the anatomy, the electrical, and the fluid mechanics, or the pressure. And so with that said, I'm going to let you guys be to chew on this and kind of collect your thoughts and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And I'll catch you on the flip side.